I'm Mohammed Tavakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to the second session of Rethinking History, Returning to Archives and Documents, a virtual seminar series co-convened with my colleague, Professor Arzu Azad of Oxford University. Rethinking History is a collaborative project of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies and the Invisible East program and the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Oxford. I am grateful to Professor Arzu Azad for this inspiring initiative. In addition, I would like to thank Professor Jenkins for accepting our invitation to share her archival explorations. Finally, I'm grateful to the Roshan Cultural Heritage Foundation and Dr. Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali for their exemplary support of the Institute at the University of Toronto. At the outset, and before introducing our speaker, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to teach, learn, and live on their ancestral homeland. Professor Jennifer Jenkins, our speaker today, will be introduced by my colleague, Professor Arzu Azad. Professor Azad.
Thank you so much, Professor Tavakkoli, for giving me the word. Thank you for being an inspiration to me as well to start this wonderful series of talks that is focused all around documents and archives, all throughout, across time and throughout the wider Iranian world. And my name is Arzu Azad. I'm at the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oxford, where I am also grateful to the donors of our project, the European Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the UK. And I'm extremely happy to be able to introduce to you today our speaker, Professor Jennifer Jenkins, and she will be talking today about Presence and Silence, the Iran Archives in the German Foreign Office. I'd like to introduce Professor Jenkins to you briefly. I'd also like to ask you to please, throughout the talk, any questions, comments you have, jot them into the chat. And then Professor Jenkins will be speaking for about 45 minutes and showing us some slides. And after that, she's very happy to take questions. And so please, don't wait to the end, just keep writing into the chat box as you think about things. And we do want to have a nice conversation going. So Jennifer L. Jenkins is a global and German historian who writes on Iran from the perspectives of international diplomacy and political economy. She's an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in German history at the University of Toronto and is working currently on 2 book manuscripts, and one is about to come out, I'm just told, and it's called The Persian Question, Germany, Iran, and the Near East in the Age of Empire, 1856 to 1914. And there's another book coming out called The German Orient, 1904 to 79. Last year, in 2022, she was a visiting scholar at the Sharmin and Bijan Musawa Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton, and she has had fellowships from the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto, the Canada Research Chairs Program, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Harvard University, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. She's been an associate at the Zentrum Moderne Orient in Berlin in 2017 and 2018, a senior associate member of St. Anthony's College here in Oxford in 2013 and 2014, and an Eva and Viktor Klemperer Fellow at the Technical University of Dresden in Germany, and that was in December 2019. And without further ado, Professor Jenkins, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Arzu, for the kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. And thank you to Mohammed and Arzu for the opportunity to speak today, because as you will see, I find the topic of rethinking history in the light of documents and sources to be very appealing, as I've been working extensively in a collection that is not well known. One of the largest sets of documents on Iranian history is a forgotten archive, and it's located in the depths of the German Foreign Office in Berlin. I came across this archive several years ago, many years ago at this point. I was working on German Orientalism, and my interest in this topic brought me into the archive's reading room. I had been frustrated by the excessively national focus of the scholarship on German Orientalism, as it always seemed to be about German national culture as seen from inside of Germany. And I wanted to locate sources from people who had traveled outside of the country and who had traveled in the Ottoman Empire and in Iran, and who were looking at Germany from the perspective of Istanbul or from the perspective of Tehran. As part of my research on Orientalism, I had been working on the archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld, who was the leader of the Persepolis excavation in the 1930s, and was a man whose professional career spanned both Germany and Iran. So I wanted to explore, in general, the networks connecting the two countries and the feasibility of doing a larger project on these networks. So at the time, several historians in my field were working on Germany and the Ottoman Empire, but no one was exploring Iran. Colleagues in German history, though, told me that this was a non-starter. They said there is nothing there. They said the topic of Germany and Iran is of limited interest. So I wondered whether I would find anything. I started with the indexes and archival aids at the Foreign Office Archive, and I began my search. This search became more and more protracted as I discovered more and more material. First were just simply the pages of notations in the indexes and Findbücher, just all of the long lines of notations to various collections on Deutsch-Persische Beziehungen, German-Persian relations. So pages and pages of these. So I started there. I ordered these files. I began reading through them. I read the German handwriting, the 19th century handwriting. So I was reading the handwritten notes on the documents, and that was leading me to more collections and to more documents. I then applied for a year-long Humboldt research grant to explore the topic of Germany and Iran and to explore this archive. And during that time, during those 12 months in Germany working on this archive, I worked with an archivist, a German archivist, to help me assess the size and scope of what was emerging, namely a huge and not well understood document collection. So together we compiled a master list of all of the collections on Iran that were held in the Foreign Office Archive and in the Federal Archive in Berlin, in the Bundesarchiv. And this was just a list of different topics, like 4 cartons, 10 cartons, just a list of all of the different collections. The list ran to 85 single-spaced pages, and we weren't able to finish it. So as I was working across this sprawling collection, and then working with the details, because many of these documents are very detailed, working with the details of one document after another, a number of times I felt like I was reassembling a ship but let's say a shipwrecked ship. I was reassembling the ship from the pieces that were strewn across the ocean floor. Using a different metaphor, and this is the one I feel now, I sometimes tell people I feel like without knowing I was doing it, I hooked a whale. I caught a whale, and now I've been trying to drag this whale to the shore. So my colleagues had clearly been wrong. Rather than no documentation, I had found too much in some ways. I had found a wealth of documentation. This was an enormous archive, or is an enormous archive, and it's a forgotten one. It's been left behind by the events of the Second World War, the Cold War, and the Islamic Revolution. Deep in these collections, so deep that at that level there is no public index for, I came to these things through these handwritten notes. So deep in the collections are 73 very large cartons containing what I came to realize was the working archive of the German legation in Tehran during the interwar period, the 1920s and the 1930s. This had been packed up in 1941. It had been packed up again in 1979 and transported to Bonn, the capital of West Germany, and then packed up again in the early 2000s and sent to Berlin. Some of these boxes, there's sort of these huge, big, heavy cartons, and as I open them up, in some of them you just have all of this, sort of everything wrapped in paper and lots of rope and twine with very old knots. As I was undoing these things, some of the boxes appeared not to have been unpacked since they were packed up in 1941, potentially. There were layers and layers of rope and old knots and lots of dust. Inside were just stacks of documents, either not ordered or only minimally ordered by, it kind of was like everything taken out of a file cabinet and just placed in a box, but they were ordered by topic. The cartons were then ordered by topic, but inside it was just a mass of documentation. Now, suffice it to say, the surfacing of all of this material came as a tremendous surprise, because juxtaposed to this archival presence, this enormous archival footprint, is a grand silence in the secondary literature. The topic of Germany and Iran has virtually no presence in the modern historiography of either country. And this is one reason why I could stumble into this veritable forest of paper without knowing of its existence. Iran is written out of most histories of German foreign policy, and Germany does not figure in most histories of modern Iran. So two questions come up. Why is this so? And what was it? What exactly had I found? So today I would like to introduce this archive, its size, its scope, and some of the topics it covers, and then also to reflect on how Iran's modern history can be rethought in the light of these documents. Now, the archive holds a wealth of detailed historical information. Thousands of documents cover a dizzying array of topics. They range from diplomatic reports on the expansion of German trade into the Black Sea Basin, the Ottoman Empire, and Iran starting in the late 1850s, on the desires of German diplomats to modernize Iran with roads, railroads, and financial institutions. On the connections, there's all kinds of reports on the connections between these diplomats in Tehran and Iranian nationalist politicians, which focused on their mutual modernization dreams. And then lots of information on the anxiety felt by British and Russian officials at the German presence in their midst. In fact, intra-imperial tension, as the Germans are there kind of really starting in the 1880s, Germany opens its consulate in Tehran in 1885. And this inter-imperial tension and entanglement is central to this archive. In fact, that intra-imperial entanglement is one of the reasons why this archive is so big. German diplomats outlined and criticized the workings of British power in Iran, and they reported in detail on the building of Russian spheres of influence in the northern parts of the country, and then on the militarization of these areas after 1911, on the tens of thousands of troops that were in occupation of northern Iran in the years leading into the First World War. German diplomats outlined the ways in which the Anglo-Russian conflict, known by the romantic title, The Great Game, even though this is an excessively romantic title because there wasn't much romance about it, the German diplomats report on how this great game scarred Persian terrain and exploited the country's resources and its people. Searching for a competitive edge, these diplomats also reported extensively on what were called local conditions. These documents provide a rich documentation for tracing Iran's social, economic, and political transformation from the period of the late 1890s onward. For example, there is a 5-volume trade report made during a trade mission of 1907-08 that discusses in detail the economic changes taking place across Iran's different regions. So the more I worked in this archive, the more I saw that it is a record of the world created by empire. And so this is also why the few studies that exist of Germany and Iran are often written as examples of bilateral relations between two nation states, but that doesn't really work for this archive. That leaves out a lot. Bilateral relations or nation states do not really capture what's in these documents, because although this archive obviously is focused on Germany, and it's the product of German diplomacy, these files do not tell just one national story. This archive was created by an expanding and confident German Foreign Office that was eager to promote the expansion of its trade and secure Germany's position in what was called the Weltwirtschaft, the world economy. So this archive really speaks about the globalizing world before 1914 and then into the 20th century, and the place of Germany and Iran in it. The documents also show that from the beginning of its interaction with Iran, Germany approaches the country differently than did its European counterparts. Now, rather than focusing on the favorite topics of European diplomats, the British do this, the French do this, the Russians do this, they focus on Iran's strangeness and backwardness, its distance from Europe, its underdevelopment, its poverty and corruption, all evidence, as British and Russian commentators often said, of Iran's Oriental despotism. The Germans do not do this. It's very interesting. I went looking for Orientalism. I found something very different. The documents in this archive show how German officials viewed Iran as a site of geostrategic opportunity. Iran had been a crossroads of world trade. Potentially, it would be so once again. And these diplomats' open and future-oriented perspective endeared them to Iranian nationalists, many of who welcomed Germany as a possible European partner for the country's industrial development. These nationalists hoped that Germany would provide needed protection against the predatory policies of both Great Britain and Russia, and that Germany could modernize the country with machinery, with money, and with modern science. And it's the constitutional movement in Iran, starting in 1906, that attempts to put these beliefs into practice. So I'm going to do two things now with the remainder of the time. First, I'm going to introduce some of the types of documents and topics in this archive. And then I want to tell a story that this archive has allowed me to bring together, which is what I see as really the core of the modern relationship between Germany and Iran, which are these ties forged between German diplomats and Iranian nationalists during the Constitutional Revolution, starting in 1906. So that's really the core of the modern relationship, and that then plays forward into the 20th century. Okay, so first off, pardon me, I have allergies a bit. So I'm going to share my screen to show you some of these documents. So here we go. So the types of documents, there's lots of different types, but they're mainly diplomatic reports and correspondence, but all sorts of types of those. Lots of trade reports, personal papers from diplomats, memoirs, diaries, and letters, some of which have been published, many of which have not. Lots of things on infrastructure projects, on these modernization dreams, all kinds of inter-imperial reporting, the Germans reporting on what the British are doing, what the Russians are doing, or what the British and Russians are doing with each other. So here's some examples. This is from the Nachlass. These are the personal papers of this diplomat, Otto Blau. This was the trade mission in 1857. That really sets, this is on this ground, the first modern sort of treaty between Prussia at that time and Iran is signed in 1857. And it's based on this trade mission by Otto Blau. So reports of the mission, he's really central to drafting the treaty that results in 1857, which incidentally is based on Iran signs a treaty with the United States in 1856, which is actually very interesting. And this German one, is based on that one. So these early trade reports. Then lots of things on infrastructure plans. So you see these are some of these big files, these Akten. And this just says Allgemeine Angelegenheiten Persiens. This is the 19th century script. So general things in Persia. It's from 1907. This is one of many infrastructure plans. A lot of things are thought out and proposed and put down on paper and discussed in the period before 1914. Very little is actually accomplished. A number of these things, though, are attempted in the period after 1928, when big German companies begin coming into Iran and making contracts, making concessions with Reza Shah, and then industrializing the country, including the building of the Trans-Iranian Railway. The Germans are in, it's a German-Scandinavian consortium. So lots of things on these infrastructure plans. This here, these are diplomatic reports. This is from the period of the Balkan Wars. This is the first Balkan War, December 1912, on the political situation in Iran. These reports, this is to make the point also that the Germans always see Iran as part of a regional, they have a kind of regional strategy. What they do in Iran and what they do in the Ottoman Empire is very similar. Or when they move forward in the Ottoman Empire, they move back in Iran and back and forth like that. So Iran is always seen as part of this larger region. And that's quite important. And the ways that, for example, when the constitutionalist armies move forward in 1909, when the Schuster mission is dismissed in 1911, when the Russians move troops into the north of the country starting in 1912, a lot of that is moving in rhythm with the Balkan Wars across the Near East. And the German diplomats they often talk about Iran in connection with the Balkans, with the Ottoman Balkans, because at that time, these were two wings of Russian sort of forward movement and power. And in fact, the diplomats move between Tehran and Belgrade, for example, the Russian diplomats. And so Iran is always seen in this larger context. And that's actually a very important part of the history that emerges from this archive. There's a lot on intra-imperial tension. This here is from May 1914. This is the German ambassador to London, Lichnowsky, writing to the Chancellor Bettmann Hollweg. He's reporting, he sends the Blue Book. This is the set of documentation around the British Treasury was acquiring a majority share in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company at that time. And to that purpose, they were trying to renegotiate the Anglo-Russian concession, or the Anglo-Russian Convention, pardon me. This is in May, June, and July of 1914. And the Germans report on all of this. This map is really fascinating. Actually, here it is in a bigger format. This is an aspirational map. This is what, this is attached to that blue book that goes forward into the parliament. This is what the British wanted to achieve, in that you see that there's no more neutral zone any longer, or no British zone, that the zone of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's concession is this red area, that will all be part. This is what the British wish to have. And the price, what they will give the Russians, you see Iran's northern provinces here, will become part of the Russian Empire. So that's part of the trade. This is June of 1914. So if the First World War had not happened, this might not have been such an aspirational map. But I found this fascinating. All of these negotiations about Iran, but really over the heads of its government. The Germans report on this in detail. So moving forward, on the German side, the military and intelligence missions that are in Iran in the Ottoman Empire in World War I. The World War I files in the German Foreign Office are absolutely huge. They're kind of beyond belief. There's lots of information in there about what in Iranian history is known as the Kaveh Group, but for the German Foreign Office and military intelligence, it was called the Persian Independence Committee. But this is a picture of Reza Tarbiyat and Hassan Taqizadeh and Mohammed Ali Jamalzadeh at the editorial offices of Kaveh in Berlin. The German Foreign Office had provided to the Persian Independence Committee and to the Indian Independence Committee a press. And it was on that press that Kaveh is printed. And the Persian Committee and the Indian Independence Committee work extensively together. And so there's documentation on all of these things. This is the Persian Independence Committee here. This is a fascinating episode, which I've published on. This is one of the areas in the archive where I've published articles and things. But this has been fascinating to work on. Inside of German military intelligence, these independence committees were part of what was called the Revolution Program. So moving forward, this is into the 1920s, when German companies and then a whole lot of Russian German refugees come into Iran during the Reza Shah period. The companies begin coming in kind of massively after 1928 and into the 1930s. And then these Russian German refugees are refugees from the Soviet Union. And in German historiography, they're called Russlanddeutsche. And they're from the Caucasus, they're from Iran, or pardon me, they're from the Caucasus, they're from Ukraine, a lot of them. They're fleeing Stalinist policies. They're German, but they're actually ethnically very complex. These families also linguistically are quite complex. But the German legation in Tehran gives them documentation, gives them papers that documents who they are and makes it so they won't be deported back into the Soviet Union. So there's lots of documentation on these people. They also work for a number of the companies that are in Iran. A number of them work on building the Trans-Iranian Railroad. This is also into the 1930s. This is also the period of when the German community in Iran it's made up of sort of people who work for the diplomats and everyone around the Foreign Office, but then all the people working for the German companies. And these are companies like the AEG and Siemens, the big companies, the Vereinigte Stahlwerke, which is a steel company, Philipp Holtzmann, which is the construction firm that built the Baghdad Railroad and is part of the consortium building the Trans-Iranian Railroad. So you have people working for all of these companies. You have all these engineers. You have kind of smaller machine shops. There are all kinds of different kinds of Germans who are there in Tehran mainly, and in Tabriz during the 1930s. There's also a small but very active and very vocal wing of the Nazi Party in Tehran. They form, and the Foreign Office is also Nazified after 1933. So you have this, but you also have all of these refugees. So these are some of the pictures, the documentation for all of these refugees coming out of the Caucasus and out of the Soviet Union. These pictures come from that. There are lots of pictures of women, just single women with children, lists of the people coming, and then all of their documentation. So you have a large number of these Russian-German refugees, but you also have German Jewish refugees leaving Germany and going to Iran. There are also Jewish refugees amongst the Russlanddeutsche. So it's a very, very active mix of people, who were Germans or Germans, refugees. I wrote an article. This is one of the topics that I first sort of researched in detail, because there were enormous boxes in that archive from the interwar legation, big boxes of all of this documentation on these refugees. So that was one of the first topics that I worked on in detail, and it's fascinating. Then moving forward, Iran is divided, as you all know, divided between the British and the Soviets as they invade and divide the country following the German attack on the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, during the war. So the Germans are not in Iran, but they are around it. And this is from the war. This is Franz von Papen, the famous von Papen, who helped Hitler into power. He is the German ambassador in Ankara during the war. And in this document, which I chose here, this is where he's speaking about the Russian-English demarcation zones in Iran. So all of this regional wartime surveillance. So examples of some of the documents in this very large archive. So for the remainder of the time, just check the time here. The remainder of the time, I would like to sort of talk about what I see as the core of the modern relationship between Germany and Iran. These are the ties forged between German diplomats and Iranian nationalists during the Constitutional Revolution of 1906-09, and then some of the effects of how that then plays forward. So without further ado, we'll move now to the Constitutional Revolution. And this, and so what I'm going to relate now is a story that this archive has sort of revealed to me. This is a story that the archive has allowed, this archive has allowed me to bring together. So, a primary cause of the Constitutional Revolution was the bankruptcy of the Qajar state, as this had been aided and abetted by British and Russian officials. Starting in 1888, these officials, Russian and British, had used their political influence over the Shah, over the court, and over the ministers to gather valuable economic concessions. These targeted the lucrative extraction of natural resources, so mineral rights, agricultural rights. The tobacco concession is one of the best known here, but also concessions on all kinds of natural resources, including fish and caviar in the Caspian Sea, timber in Iran's northern provinces, all kinds of agricultural goods, but also concessions that exerted control over roads and waterways, contracts for the building of infrastructure, and the securing of customs revenues. Now, these concessions, which are thick on the ground, they begin to mark out what are called zones of exclusion in the north and the south of the country. And so the revolution is in part a reaction to this situation. By 1906, as the Qajar court is staggering under the burden of its foreign loans, because the Russian and the British imperial banks were only too happy to loan money to the Shah. So the Qajar court is staggering under the burden of foreign loans and interest payments. A protest led by merchants and clerics kicks off the popular movement for reform. So was actually made into a postcard at a later date, the merchants bust in the summer of 1906. In its opening event, these protesters, numbering the tens of thousands, called for rights and freedoms. They called for a free press, for the freedom of association, for equality before the law, for the institution of a parliament that would check the power of the Shah. They call for a written constitution, and they also call for a national bank in order to oppose the imperial banks of the Russians and the British. So with this call for a national bank, this is where Germany enters the story. German newspapers had been reporting on the revolution inside of Germany, and actually very sympathetically. And by 1906, prominent constitutionalists are approaching, actually 1905 into 1906, approaching Germany's officials in Tehran with offers to partner in what they're calling the modernization of the state. It was hoped that these officials, these German officials, who are seen as spokesmen for Germany's commercial power and institutional expertise, would aid in Iran's transformation into a modern administrative state. And part of the reason for this call is that in the Russian Empire itself, it had been a lot of German experts and German officials, or also Baltic Germans, that were known to have created the administrative state in Russia. So could that kind of expertise be called on here as well? Now, German diplomats, and here's the minister in Tehran at this time, this is Wilhelm Stemmerich. The German minister, Stemmerich, he's clear where Berlin stands in this conflict. And in general, these German diplomats support the Iranian nationalist movements and its claims to sovereignty. And that's very important because the Russians and the British do not do this, but the Germans do. So Stemmerich is very clear about where he thinks Berlin stands in this conflict, and he's reporting this back to Berlin. He says this new parliament needs funds, and we need a closer relationship with the parliament. Thus, German officials recognize the Majlis and its attempt to create new financial institutions, a national treasury, a tax system, and the control on concessions on trade and industrial development should be sort of under the oversight of the parliament, not the Shah. The Stemmerich says he's sympathetic to this, to aid the Majlis in attempting an administrative reform of the Iranian state. And he supports the nationalist call for economic sovereignty, what we would now call economic sovereignty regarding state debt and the ownership of natural resources. So Stemmerich says, yes, we will work with you in this attempt to create a national bank. This would be a state bank for Iran and a trade bank for Germany. And for example, one of the reasons why this is needed, it's the Imperial Bank of Persia, the British Imperial Bank of Persia, has the rights over the printing of the money. So you see there, even the printing of the money, the Iranian nationalists want a state bank because the printing of the money is an aspect of the state's sovereignty. That should be under the control of an Iranian bank, not an imperial bank. So for members of the Majlis, national sovereignty is connected to what we would call now economic sovereignty. And per the 1906 Constitution, the parliament, rather than the Shah, is to exercise authority over all, it was said, quote, foreign loans, contracts, and concessions, end of quote. So representatives of the first parliament of October 1906 believed that the foreign debt that had been brokered for the Shah via the Russian and British imperial banks was one of the greatest dangers facing this new state. They drew lessons from the fates of their neighbors, from Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, which had European-controlled debt commissions. These states had become mortgaged states, or what's called in the literature now a mortgaged state, sovereign in name only, but without real freedom or independence, given that they could be dictated to and constrained by these debt commissions. The parliamentarians in the Majlis feared being subjected to such a debt commission, and they thought that one could be coming. And so in February 1907, they set out a list of demands to clean the proverbial financial household. The prevention of any fresh loans from Russia or England was at the top of the list. These were followed by others. That a limit be placed on the Shah's spending. That what in these documents was called maktahil. And then Mohammed was asking me, what is this exactly? In this document, that's defined as, I quote, irregular and illegal profits, that this be abolished, that foreigners in posts controlling customs revenue, specifically the Belgian officials who currently held these posts, that they be removed and replaced by administrators responsible to Parliament. As part of this list was also the demand that a new national bank be established, and a bank concession was negotiated and signed between German officials like Stemmerich and the Majlis. It was seen as a key to this situation, in that finances for the government, as well as the administration of what now was being called national revenue, rather than the Shah's purse, as well as the highly politicized issue of the terms on which the government would negotiate its lending, that all of these things were primary concerns, and resolving Iran's financial questions was seen as central to the political struggle. Success or failure in this area could determine the course of the revolution. The German diplomats also saw very clearly the benefit of negotiating with a new set of partners. So rather than collaborating with the Shah and his court, or trying to work through Russian or British officials, Germany would now partner directly with the Persian nationalists, the politicians, and the businessmen, thus gaining a strategic edge. So Stemrich's, one of his main interlocutors is this man here, Sani ad-Dawla, who is a member of the Hedayat family. He had studied mineralogy in Germany, so he had German experience. He was an industrialist with his own plans for railroads, sugar refining plants, and textile factories, and his interest in forging a modern state structure and legal system for Iran in its aid to industrialize the country. These interests aligned with Stemrich's own. He later becomes the finance minister and is described in British documents as German-friendly. The Russians will later assassinate him for exactly that fact. So being German-friendly, in the eyes of the Russians, this proved to be this man's undoing. Now, actions taken by German officials and Iranian nationalists around economic sovereignty, they were practical, they were financial, and they were institutional. A lot of these things do not come to pass, but when the Schuster mission comes in, it's interesting. When Germany has to vacate Iran in 1911, this is the Potsdam Agreement, which I could talk about more in the discussion if there's interest. This is about that the Russians are going to build the trunk railroad in Iran, the Persian trunk railroad, which will be connected to the Baghdad Railway. And as part of the price for this, that the Germans will remove any kind of political support for the Iranian nationalist movement. This is 1911. At that point, when they have to remove this support, the nationalists lose this even minimal protection. It was at that point that the ultimatums go to the Majlis and that the Russians begin moving troops, tens of thousands of troops into the northern sphere. So the way that these things connect together. But the brief for the Schuster mission, when Schuster comes, what he is to do, what he is tasked with doing by the Majlis, which is to create a national treasury, a modern tax system, and all of these things. In a way, it's the list of what the Germans had written out, that this is now what Schuster is going to try and put into practice, and what he's also not able to do. So these things about economic sovereignty, but in thinking about sovereignty more generally, and this is a very important point, sovereignty in this context, that the German diplomats recognize the legitimacy of the Iranian nationalist movement and its claims to sovereignty. This is huge. And this is commented upon by the British in Iran. So for example, in contrast to Germany, British and Russian diplomats did not recognize the claims of what they called at the time Muslim nations, including Iran. Russian and British officials throughout the revolution, the constitutional revolution, routinely denigrate Persian politics. They don't call it politics, they call it disorder, they call it anarchy. Whereas German officials speak of a reform movement with legitimate claims, and they call it nationalism, and they call it politics, they call it reform. They don't call it anarchy, they don't call it disorder. So this is a major difference here. Discussions between British and German diplomats in Tehran raised this issue of the sovereignty claims of the Iranian nationalist movements. And for example, this man here, this is Cecil Spring Rice, who was the British at the British embassy in Tehran during the Constitutional Revolution. Prior to that, he had been in St. Petersburg. He was the representative to Russia. And he ends his career as the British ambassador to the United States. He's a very important diplomat. And Cecil Spring Rice actually had very interesting things to say about this situation, because he sees London's rejection of Iranian nationalism as a flaw, a potentially very large flaw in British imperial diplomacy, realizing that the moral claims underpinning British diplomacy would be shown to be hollow. And in this sense, the Iranian nationalists, it said that they expected the Russians to be autocratic, that the Russians were autocratic was not a surprise, but that they expected something different from the British. And then Kazemzadeh's older book on Britain and Russia and Persia makes this point quite eloquently, that the disappointment in the British was very pronounced. Now, Spring Rice, for his part, he worried that Britain's position in the Persian, sort of the ways that Britain was approaching the constitutionalist movement, was a serious problem. Specifically, the contempt shown by British officials to the new political forces emerging in Iran was a matter of large concern. As he wrote to the editor of the London Times, his Valentine Shirol, who's in the middle, and this is one of Shirol's books here, The Middle Eastern Question. So Spring Rice writes to Shirol. He says that Britain's lack of any real support for the constitutionalists, for Iranian nationalism, and for the parliamentary aspirations, that Britain does not support this at all. This is experienced in Iran as hypocrisy, or worse. He says, he gave Shirol an example where he says, this is in his letters, he says, a Turkish diplomat asked me, Spring Rice wrote, quote, if England hates Muslimanism, that's how he, instead of Islam, he says, if England hates Muslimanism so much that even when a Muslim nation becomes a free one, England fights against her freedom, end of quote. He says, this is a deep and serious problem for Britain across the empire. In this quote here that's on the slide, I fear our abandonment of the cause of liberty as soon as it is adopted by a Muslim nation. The continuation of this quote, he says, there's then, quote, our alliance with the enemy of liberty, by which he meant Russia, quote, because it is a Christian power. All of this leaves this impression, end quote, of hypocrisy. He believed that the incomprehension of the Persian constitutionalists regarding Britain's position would only curdle into bitterness, and that the German officials are supporting the national movement deepens the problem. Coming at the issue from the other side, Paul Dehn, who's a German imperial publicist, these are some of his works here, he gave a very interesting reading of events. Iran's constitutionalist movement, he wrote, did not emulate English developments. It was parliamentary, but it was not English. Its anti-imperialist nationalism had an anti-British character. Quote, with the help of parliamentary interests, England hopes to make moral and other conquests in Persia, end of quote, he wrote. The parliamentarism in Persia did not support the imperial status quo. The Russo-Japanese War had changed all of that. And then this quote here that I have on the slide, where he says, and I quote, in fact, it is precisely this parliamentarism which appears to have, in connection with the rise of Japan, instigated a movement in Persia that directs itself against Russian as well as English special interests. Persian national feeling has also begun to awaken and expresses itself in the demand, Persia for the Persians and governed by the Persians. The German side has greeted this movement with sympathy, end of quote. So here is precisely the issue that worried Spring Rice. That Germany and not England is the European partner for the Iranian national movement, and that Germany and not England was the European precisely the issue that worried Spring Rice. This is an important point, so I want to make sure it's clear. That Germany and not England was the supporter of Persian constitutionalism, and but that Germany and not England is the European partner of the Iranian national movement. So from diametrically opposed political positions, Paul Dehn is a pan-German. Cecil Spring Rice is a liberal imperialist. These two men had arrived at the same observation. The crossing of the lines, Germany in support of Iran's national movement and Britain against, was soon to come to a head. Because from the first signs of German support in Iran, this had a really sort of galvanizing effect on spurring forward the Anglo-Russian negotiations. And Germany's presence in Iran is going to be central to the shape of those negotiations, their tempo, and the agreement that results from them. So here, this is the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 and its partition of Iran. That the British and the Russians had been trying to find a way to resolve their imperial differences since the 1880s. This is this famous agreement of 1907, focused on Tibet, Persia, Tibet, and Afghanistan. So Iran's political transformation was playing an important role in the forward movement of European imperial politics. So these three topics, Germany's bank project, the constitutional revolution in Iran, and the Anglo-German negotiations leading toward this convention of 1907, these are most often treated separately, but this archive brings them together. And the diplomats at the time brought them all together. This is part of this entangled world of empire. So diplomats at the time certainly saw the interconnections and reported on them. Iran's revolution had been spurred by imperial upheaval, and its struggle for national sovereignty is playing out in an arena shaped by imperial conflict. The two issues being negotiated in 1907, Iranian nationality and imperial stability were not separate issues. Many saw them as entangled. More to the point, imperial officials in London and St. Petersburg are using the Iranian conflict to spur forward this new consensus between themselves, that they needed something to sort of push them forward to a final agreement, and this is what does it. Arthur Nicholson, who is the British ambassador in St. Petersburg, plays a central role in these events. He's also one of the designers of this, the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, and he explicitly connects their negotiations, the Anglo-Russian negotiations, to an anti-German policy in Persia from the very beginning. So what historians have called a campaign of agitation against Germany and the German bank was a drumbeat accompanying the Anglo-Russian negotiations toward their agreement. And here we have, this is kind of typical, this is from Punch of 1907. We have the British lion and the Russian bear, and this is Persian cat. And this comic, which is not very funny, says the lion says to the bear, "You can play with his head and I can play with his tail and we can stroke the small of his back." And the cat says, "I don't remember having been consulted about this." So in this, with this campaign of agitation against Germany and the German bank accompanying these negotiations, the upshot of this is that neither Germany nor the constitutionalists are going to be allowed to advance, and the ties between them are to be broken. The alternate future for Iran, signaled by German involvement, is not going to be allowed to happen. Spring Rice's letters from Tehran described the strategy of what he called painting the German devil on the wall as a way to bridge the differences between the British and the Russian sides. And the international press war on the German bank in Tehran was certainly about this German devil in Iran and elsewhere. Now, Spring Rice himself had his doubts about these negotiations and about this convention. He believed that the resulting agreement would be fragile, given the animosities between Russia and Britain and the lack of real solutions to their differences. But he says what they could agree on was what was going on in Iran and the necessity of suppressing what both sides called Persian disorder. Spring Rice noted here that Britain would have the assistance, or at least the quiescence, of the Shah and the enthusiastic participation of the Russians. As he wrote, and I quote, "My impression is that now Russia has successfully changed her constitution and got rid of her Duma, she won't be very anxious to see another Duma next door and will take measures to get rid of it. As the Shah is of the same mind, they are two of a trade and they will act together." End of quote. And this proved to be a prescient observation. Now, at this juncture, two issues come to the fore, and I'm coming to the end. So I know this is a lot of detail. So two issues come to the fore at this juncture. One is national and one is imperial. First, what in Iranian historiography is called the third power policy, written about as a staple of Iranian foreign policy in the 20th century, this does not begin with Reza Shah Pahlavi in the 1920s, but with the constitutionalists' approach to German officials in the summer of 1906. Secondly, the consequences of Germany's recognition of Iranian sovereignty cannot be overlooked. The Russians and the British agreed on very little in Iran, but starting in 1906, they make common cause on two issues: suppressing the constitutional revolution and creating a common front against Germany. The Anglo-Russian Convention, signed on August the 31st, 1907 in St. Petersburg, killed two birds with one stone. It was not solely driven by the desire to block Germany's ambitions in the abstract, nor was it done only with regard to the European balance of power. It's almost always, whenever Germany is discussed here, it's talked about that the British and the Russians are trying to block Germany in Europe. But this is not Germany in Europe. This is what was called at the time Germany in Asia. So the convention has an imperial rationale and a very specific Near Eastern referent. It takes direct aim at breaking up the new constellation of Germany and Persia's constitutionalists and the possible alternate future for Iran that this relationship represented. The German threat did not only wear a Prussian helmet, it was here in Persian garb, with the Iranian nationalists looking toward German support for their sovereignty claims. So the story of Germany's role in Iran's constitutional revolution is not well known, yet its effects on the international system were significant. The direct connections established between German diplomats and Persian constitutionalists destabilized British foreign policy and roiled international relations. Germany in Asia was a new kind of threat. On that, the Russians and the British could agree. Thus, as Iranian nationalists moved toward Germany as a new kind of partner, Berlin becomes a new kind of enemy for both London and St. Petersburg. German officials and Iranian nationalists saw their partnership as a way to bypass the Anglo-Russian conflict, and as a result, anti-German sentiment increasingly becomes the lever through which the British and Russian officials seek their modus operandi with each other. So, as I analyze in my forthcoming book from which this example is taken, Germany's involvement in Iran's constitutional revolution is a forcing ground of the Anglo-Russian Entente, formalized as this convention of 1907. And then the ways that this then plays forward. For example, the roots of the Kaveh group. So in 1910-11, as prominent constitutionalists are being forced into exile in the Ottoman Empire and in Europe, so they're going everywhere. Taqizadeh goes first to the Ottoman Empire, then to Istanbul, then he goes, he is the guest of E.G. Browne in Britain, and then he's in New York. He's working in the New York Public Library as a bibliographer for their manuscript collections. And this is Izzadullah Hedayat, who was, I'm trying to remember where he is, so these prominent constitutionalists kind of go everywhere. A lot of them are in Switzerland, in France. Hussein Kuli Khan, who is here, pictured here, he was the foreign minister for the constitutionalist government. He's in Paris in 1914. Taqizadeh is in New York. The German Foreign Office then, as they're building these independence committees, who are going to run these intelligence operations during the war behind the lines of the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Russian empires, they go out looking for these Iranian constitutionalists. They find Taqizadeh in New York and bring him to Berlin, and he then is tasked with gathering the others. This is Rudolf Nadolny, the diplomat who is sort of the contact person with the Foreign Office and the section of military intelligence for this whole First World War episode, which is fascinating, of the Persian Independence Committee. So that's one of the places that this goes. So I will end there. I look forward to your questions, and I thank you for your attention. I just thought this, if people wanted to read a bit more about any of these topics, this is a list on the 20th century side of this project. I published a whole number of articles. And then this is the book that I am finishing, which is on the 19th century side. Hopefully it is coming soon. So thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Jenkins. That was a real amazing show of the documents. I think we all have a really nice insight into some of these examples and the incredible work you've done with these documents. There have been lots of comments, accolades, questions coming in the chat, and I will try to field them to you. If I may abuse my own position as chair, but there's also a question in here that kind of echoes what I was, one of the many things I want to ask you, but I'll just ask one because our listeners have been patiently waiting, could you tell us how you gained access, a bit more detail on how you gained access to this archive? Was it difficult? How did you choose the documents in the end that you were going to work with? I mean, I'm assuming if you had boxes and boxes and boxes, dozens of them, how was it just a random close your eyes and point at a box? Or what was sort of your methodology? And then I will field the questions.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the question. Access to the archive. Its formal title is The Political Archive of the German Foreign Office, is not a terribly user-friendly place. You have to have a letter from your embassy saying that you are actually a researcher. And I mean, it's easy to get these letters, but you have to have an official letter to be allowed access. It's not initially a user-friendly place, but as I've worked on this collection for many, many years. And so with time, I mean, the archivists there have been amazing and they know me well. But when I was first there, they didn't know exactly. I mean, there was quite a long period where they didn't quite know what to make of what I was doing. And also, like, is she American? Is she Canadian? Is she working on Germany? Is she working on Iran? They didn't, and there was some amount of there was some incomprehension that I had to break through. I mean, at this point, though, the archivists there have been amazing and incredibly helpful. For example, with the World War I sources, there is a handwritten index to these sources, a much older one that was being created during the war itself. And they brought this out and let me use it so that I could then kind of parachute into this, using this information, I could then land inside of these huge microfiche collections, kind of, and land more on my target. So they've been incredible. But it was not easy. I really just started with the finding aids and just started ordering the materials and reading through. I am, in general, a very archival historian. I really love working with documents, and I can read the old script. And I think that, and my German is fluent, and I can read the 19th century script. And that's really crucial for deciphering all the handwritten things on these documents. So it was through reading the handwritten notes that led me forward, and that also for the archivists in the reading room, they could see that I knew to some extent what I was doing. And so they were helping me. How I came to the big interwar archive, which was pretty astonishing. I was reading these handwritten notes on documents that kept pointing toward a collection called Tabriz #1. See more in Tabriz #1, more documentation in Tabriz #1. So I'm looking through the finding aids in the reading room, and I'm not finding anywhere where this would be. So I showed this to the archivist in the reading room. I said, what is this Tabriz #1? Where would I locate that over here in the finding aids? And he said, oh no, there's no index. I said, what do you mean there's no index? And he said, how is there no index? There's so many indexes over here. And he said, no, that's in the Altbestand, the old collection. So the Altbestand, you mean so basically, in some ways, there's a whole nother shadow archive that's there that is not in these public. So this was a huge breakthrough. So I said, well, where's the index to the Altbestand? He said, no, there's no index. But he then brought me a typewritten list. The next day I got 17 pages of typewritten list that listed these 73 cartons. And so, however, this was before they fully trusted me. So, and I heard like the guy who had given me the index, then the guy who was supervising him, they were having words, and I thought, oh no, I better not give this back, because if I give this back, I'm not going to see it again. So I sat down and I typed it all up. I just sat down and I typed into my computer, because this was also at a time when you couldn't take pictures. I typed that whole thing into my computer.
Wow.
And so I replicated the list, and then I started ordering the cartons and had just opening them up and it was, so I have been working on this for a long time. It is a sprawling archive. Let me maybe just go back for a second. Sorry, want to give it's hard to give kind of a short answer to this question. Here, when you said, how did I choose the documents? This is one reason why I've published a lot of articles from this research, and the article format lends itself better to the collection itself, because I could carve out certain topics and go into them in detail. Like, for example, this was these boxes on the refugees, and then all of the other boxes on the companies, and bringing these two things together. So sort of demarcating those two big collections, and then really going into them and looking at the whole situation in the 1930s. And that could have been a book in itself. I've been told that these articles are quite dense, because there's just a lot in them. But that was how I did it. I was kind of going topic by topic, and kind of then targeting a certain area of the archive, kind of the coal face, and working on that and going into that in detail. From the period after 2014, there were all of these wonderful conferences on the First World War, looking back 100 years, and on the First World War in a global context. And I had invitations to a number of those, and that's where I did a lot of work on these independence committees and on the Revolution program, and then partnered. This was a wonderful research collaboration with two colleagues at the Zentrum Moderner Orient in Berlin. Heike Liebau was writing on the Indian Independence Committee, and Larissa Schmid was writing a dissertation at the time on the Algerian and Tunisian independence committees. And I was working on the Kaveh group, the Persian committee. And so we were looking at all of the connections and all of the interactions between these committee members, and then the relations that they had with the Foreign Office and with German military intelligence. And so, and we also hoped to make a book from that. So this list here kind of shows how I really worked on topic to topic. And then this book here on the diplomats themselves, and on all of these imperial networks. This has been a long time coming, so I'm really looking forward to having it leave my desk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think just shows how you really have to be sort of focused, isn't it, when you're looking through these masses of material, each of which is fascinating, but you only have limited time. So thank you so much. I will now go through the questions. So there's first a comment by Jane Lewison that there's an article, Majle Radio, about German filming. Jane, would you like to ask your question directly?
Well, it's in the article. It says that there was Rommel had commissioned a filmmaker to make a film of the Mossadegh conflict with the English, and there's a picture of them making the film and all of that in the article. I put the picture of the article in the chat. Okay. And I attached it. I can see it in the chat. I don't know if you can see it in the chat. We have this issue
of radio and I'll share it with you.
But
too.
actually, it's not in the radio journal. I made a mistake.
Oh,
It's in Tehran Musavat.
uh-huh.
And I mean, we have it on the site, but there's a bug on the site right now. You can't see it. But this is just a snapshot of the article that I took from Tehran Musavat. And I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it, Mohammed, in the chat?
Yes, I do. And we have also Tehran Musavar, this particular issues, and I'll provide the article to Jennifer.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know about this, but I would like to know much more about it. So thank you so much.
Well, please, if you find out anything or know or can find where the films are, of course, there was so much bombing, they may have been in an archive that was destroyed. But if you do find them, please let me know.
Okay, will do.
Wonderful.
So thank you.
Thanks for that. So Fatima Sudavar says, thanks for the comprehensive scope of the German archives. And she refers to an LSE talk you gave in London, and that she mentioned that her father was recruited from the Banque Milli as the director of the Iranian offices of Ferro-Stahl, with an unprecedented salary, news of which, in the words of Ali Amini, resonated in Tehran like a cannon. His main role was to export raw materials in exchange for advanced industrial equipment for the Trans-Iranian Railway. In one case, he managed to send enough I lost my track here. He managed to send enough goods to pay for 200,000 Deutschmarks of locomotives. Is there any mention of his role in the German archives? Also, going back in time, given the proposal for a Baghdad-Enzeli canal, did you see anything on the Astara Road and the Sherkat Umumi?
No, thank you so much. And I remember talking with you in London, and that was also when I was speaking more extensively on all of these connections in the 1930s. And Ferro-Stahl was one of the major companies that was in Tehran in this period. This is also the period of what were called, a lot of the Nazi economy is organized through these clearing agreements. And the clearing agreement with Iran is signed in 1935. And so those are all of these sort of this exchange of raw materials from Iran for industrial technology from Germany. And Ferro-Stahl is one of the major companies involved in that whole episode. Any mention, I don't know specifically, but I can say, knowing this archive and these documents, that if one goes looking, you will find a lot of details on all of these things. The documents are very detailed. That's both their strength and also what makes them somewhat hard to work with, because it's just an overabundance of detail. So no, I don't know specifically about his role, but I would say that if I went looking, I probably could find. So thank you so much. Is there a way that I can keep track of all of these questions? Because I would like to take a look. Also, for the documents are full of all of these things about many, many different kinds of roads. And also the ways in which roads that are built by the British or built by the Russians in the period before 1914 are then in use primarily for the British or for the Russians, that Iranian merchants have to pay. In many cases, there's a fee. So the ways in which these zones of exclusion work, they work because of the ways in which the roads and the resources and things become sort of British or Russian property in a way. And so this is also why a lot of Iranian merchants, let's say in Tabriz, work with Russian firms or become registered with Russian firms, because they gain access then to this emerging system. And the same thing in the South. And so that's the whole ways in which, kind of the very material ways in which British and Russian geopolitical interests translate down onto the ground in Iran. That's one of the strengths of this archive. This archive will tell you about that in detail, the ways in which, or that trade report that I mentioned from 1907-08, which is 5 volumes, it's huge. And it talks in detail. It goes from one regional city to the next and really reports on these emerging networks and how the Iranians there, the merchants in, let's say, Isfahan, how they are navigating all of these new rules, all of these new, the ways in which this geopolitical conflict is translating down onto the ground, and the ways that the Iranians themselves are navigating it. And that's a fascinating aspect of these documents.
Thank you
Fantastic.
very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have so many questions. So I two very interesting questions also from Janab Sharagim. I don't know what Janab Zade. Two questions on the archival history, basically, of Germany, really. One is, how do the archives regarding Iran change after the German unification in 1871? Do geopolitical aspirations change? That's one question. The second one is, as archives often advertise their collections to draw researchers, and in thinking of the German archives as the subject, what does the lack of promotion or awareness of these archival treasures tell us about the Federal Republic's perceptions of itself and Germany's imperial past?
Okay, no, thank you. Shergim is one of my doctoral students, defended last fall. And
sorry.
I appreciate that. Again, is this in the chat? Because it helps, because it's quite long. I'm looking, but I'm not seeing it.
I can send it as a direct message to you as well, Professor Jenkins.
Okay.
Yes, please.
That sounds great. I wanted to say, for example, one of the interesting things about this archive, what it can do, is that we have these histories of these groups of Iranian sort of politicians and students who go to Germany. So we have the Kaveh group, these different generations of Iranian politicians and students who go to Germany. The Kaveh group during the World War, the Iranian students who go to Weimar Germany in the 1920s, which is the subject of Shergim's wonderful research. The Iranian leftists who go to Adenauer's West Germany in the 1950s, which is a fascinating episode all by itself. The student activists, the Iranian student activists who are actually a really big part of the West German student movement in the 1960s and are front and center in the protest against the visit of the Shah to West Berlin in June of 1967, that famous episode that radicalizes the West German student movement with the shooting of the student, Benno Ohnesorg. At the time, the Red Army faction emerges out of that moment. That's the visit of the Shah of Iran to West Berlin in June 1967. And the Persian students are kind of very involved. They're not sort of side players in the West German student movement. They're very involved. So we know, and we're knowing more about these times when groups of Iranians, politicians and students, are going to Germany, but it's really, these remain in some ways as isolated incidents until sort of the bigger framework of the larger relationships between the two countries. You then have a context in which you can place then these very important histories. You can also have a context for why Germany is being seen the way that it is by these various generations of students and politicians, the hopes it inspires, the kind of power that it's imagined to be, sometimes wrongly so, right? That Germany is imagined to be one thing, and then the students are there in Germany and discover that it's actually something else. So, okay, thank you, Shergim. I do have your question here. How do they change after the unification? Well, geopolitical aspirations, that's a big question let me take it piece by piece. After German unification in 1871, there's not the first contacts with Iran, that trade mission that I showed at the very beginning, that's 1857, that's the Prussian trade ministry. And the Prussian Foreign Office and the Prussian Trade Ministry in many ways become the core of then later the German Foreign Office and Trade Ministries. So there's a kind of continuity there. It's really Bismarck in really interesting ways in the 1880s sort of plays the British and the Russians off of each other. And he's doing this in the Near East and in the Ottoman Empire. These are also kind of forgotten histories, but one of the ways in which this archive gets forgotten is that this world of empire isn't. Anyway, it's the ways that, for example, there is a very famous document of Bismarck's called the Kissingen Diktat, which is from 1877, and it's taught in like every history of Imperial Germany, the Kissingen Diktat, and it's about the nightmare of coalitions, But this is almost always taught as if it's only referring to Europe, whereas the context of the Kissingen Diktat is that Bismarck is trying to broker things between the European powers around what becomes the Russo-Turkish War. It has a Near Eastern referent, but that referent is forgotten. It's always talked about as if it refers to the Russians on one side and the French on the other in Europe, but that's not what it's about. If you actually ground the Kissingen Diktat back into its context, it's about the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. It's about Bismarck's role as what he would then call the honest broker. Then it's one of the reasons why he then he hosts the Congress of Berlin in 1878, which puts an end to that war. So these sort of intra-imperial entanglements are really central to the archive, but they've been forgotten now. That's the aspect that's really central to what these documents are about, but which has been forgotten, like the way that it's Germany and Asia that's being reacted to by the British and the Russians in 1907, specifically. Not just Germany in Europe, Germany and Asia, that these states were what Fred Cooper, I think Fred Cooper's term is so useful. He says that these European states are empire states. The French is an empire state, the British is an empire state, and the Germans are too. And so it's these kinds of connections and entanglements that are so important. So Germany really starts getting interested. Bismarck sees that one way that he can negotiate between the British and the Russians is like, for example, the British want help with this, the Russians want help with that. Salisbury, when he's foreign minister and prime minister, comes to Bismarck and wants to renegotiate. There's the Reuter concession, the famous Reuter concession of 1872, that this is now going to be reopened. And he offers, because he wants to counter the Russians, he offers to the Germans, let's have a joint German-British condominium over Persia. And you'll bring in companies and money and German companies. So what happens much later on is sort of offered in the 1880s that you will come in and together we will develop Iran, and we will this will keep the Russians at bay. This will be a way of containing the Russians in Iran. And Bismarck considers this, and a lot of people go back and forth and discuss it, but he ultimately says no, he doesn't want to do that because that would alienate the Russians. But Bismarck is perfectly willing to kind of play the one side and then play the other side. And German diplomacy works in this way. This is one of the reasons why the German consulate in Tehran is established in 1885. It's a result of those discussions. So the geopolitical aspirations are kind of shifting all the time. One could say, I'm trying to answer it's a very big question. The Ottoman Empire doesn't fall until the end of the First World War, and then that's a whole different map altogether. Let me see your second question here. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. Could you share again? Could you I'm not exactly sure what your question's about. Could you rephrase it for me?
Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of the archive as the subject of study rather than revealing information about other topics, given that often when we go on archival websites and such, they advertise their collections, what has recently come to light and what they have digitized or whatever the case in order to draw researchers. Or what does the lack of promotion or awareness or advertisement of these archival records tell us about post-World War II and the Federal Republic's lack of interest in its own imperial history? Or is it a sort of amnesia, archival amnesia to forget the past, these imperial connections?
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. There are a number of ways to answer that. In general, I mean, what back then was called the Eastern policies. This is all the East. These were the Eastern policies. These were completely forgotten later. Eastern policies in the Federal Republic referred to, like, it was really only about the Soviet Union, not about kind of the larger, or the Near East as it was called back then. I remember there was one example when Gerhard Schröder was the chancellor in Germany, and Hatami, I believe it was Hatami, was visiting in Germany, and I was going to, it was in the summer, I'm trying to remember when this was, it was in, anyway, it was, Schröder was saying that, this must have been like 2004, maybe the summer of 2004, and Schröder was saying on German TV, saying with the occasion of Hatami's visit, Mohammed Hatami's visit, this long history between Germany and Iran. And I was kind of amazed to hear this on the television. And I imagine that people kind of, if it had any reaction at all, people watching TV, they'd say, what long history? Because it really, there is a kind of archival amnesia, certainly, about, in Germany, about its histories of empire. Or the histories of empire are really only thought about and talked about in terms of the actual settler colonies. So you have a big literature on German empire that's about the German colonies in Africa and the German colonies in the South Pacific, the settler colonies and the genocidal war against the Herero and the Nama in what's now Namibia. There's big literature on all of this, but these larger imperial connections and entanglements are only now really beginning to be fully researched. A colleague, Eric Grimmer-Zollum, who's at Wesleyan University, published a big book about 2 years ago called Learning Empire, where he talked about the Asian origins of Weltpolitik. So the famous German world policy of 1897, where it's really the situation of German trade and the interests of German trade, the German Foreign Office in China, and the kind of all of this German involvement of companies and foreign trade interests. It's really about the world economy, as it was called back then, the Weltwirtschaft, that Eric Grimmer-Zollum says this is really the context. Germany in China, Germany in Japan, German involvement in that area, that's the context for Weltpolitik, and he's absolutely right about that. So I'm trying to kind of resuscitate the awareness of a lot of these things, and other colleagues are as well.
Thank you so much
for your question.
We have quite a few major questions still coming up, and I'll read this one out, and then Mama John has agreed to take over the chairing. Thank you from Tia Shurgaya. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I enjoyed your talk and the materials presented. While exploring the documents about the Caucasians, have you come across any Georgians? In the constitutionalism period, Georgians were presented in the movement largely. After the fall of independent Georgia and occupation by Soviet Russia in 1921, many Georgians emigrated to Iran. Some of them stayed there, some went to Europe. To be short, are there any documents about Georgia or Georgians in the material in the archive? Thank you.
Yes, a lot, a whole lot. And also the ways in which Georgia becomes an object of foreign policy and military interest in the First World War. And then later, there's a lot on that. Also the Russlanddeutsche, the Russian Germans who come into Iran, and there are a few thousand of them. They come in after 1928. These are pictures of the refugees that I showed. A number of them are coming from Georgia. Tbilisi was said to be like the merchant community of Tbilisi had a lot of German merchants in it. There was a lot of German influence in Georgia. So the way that Georgia plays into this archive, it plays into it in numerous ways. There's lots of information. So yes, that is definitely there. That is definitely there. And also from this archive, you get an image of Iran as very, like there are a lot of Georgian Iranians. There are a lot of Armenian Iranians. The Armenian communities are reported on in detail. In a lot of the German interests before the First World War are located in Tabriz in Western Iran. This was seen to be as kind of an unoccupied area by the British and the Russians, and so the German companies are sort of setting foot in Tabriz. There's actually a company that begins doing the machine manufacture of Persian carpets, where the knots are tied by machine, and then the German chemical interests are all involved in all of the dyes, in sort of the ways in which German companies get involved in the creation of machine carpets, which some of these are seen as collector's objects now. So there's one of the biggest things that comes to exist before 1914 is in Tabriz, and it's this rug manufacturing plant by a company called Paytag. But also all of the connections there's a Persian merchant community in Hamburg that it has roots back to these interests first in Tabriz. Anyway, you get the ways in which kind of the Georgian influence in Iran, the Armenian influence in Iran, the Armenian communities in Iran, these are all written about in detail. So you get a very interesting picture of Iran as itself a kind of tapestry, multilingual, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic. Also, all of the Eastern Christian communities, including the Armenians that were in Western Iran, the German diplomats report on all of this in detail. So on the fact of these communities and then on their destruction in the World War. Because the Persian Armenians are destroyed in the Armenian genocide, as are the Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. The Armenian genocide jumps the border. The border is not respected by anyone during the World War. And so the Armenian genocide takes in those Armenian communities in Iran as well. And that's all in these German documents.
Thank you, Professor Jenkins. Yeah. There are a number of questions, and those who have raised questions, please raise your hand and ask it directly yourself. And that would make it easier to sort of discuss all the questions. But one by Mehdi Ghafouri. Mr. Ghafouri, do you want to ask your question directly?
I hope you hear me. I'm in Costa Rica, and it's not the internet is not that efficient.
You're very clear.
My concern was that as Dr. Jennings was explaining, I got the impression that you are concluding that the resentment of Anglo-Russian empires against Germany was the root cause of their rejection of constitutional revolution in Iran. Whereas, from what I have read, Russians and particularly British were themselves fundamentally against any modernity in Iran. And it was not simply or mainly because of Germans' sympathy for the Iranian Revolution.
That they're against, the Russians have a very explicit policy of underdevelopment in Iran and also in Eastern Anatolia, that the areas, that the southern tier of the Russian Empire, the Muslim areas, the areas or the areas just on the boundaries of this were to be kept under development. They're underdeveloped. They're explicit about this. And the fact that what the Germans want to do, the Germans are allowed to be there economically, because it's said throughout that Germany, or this is what the German diplomats always say, we don't have any political interests. We're here, we're pursuing economic interests only, but economic interests are or become political interests as well, as they did during the Constitutional Revolution, where the constitutionalists and the sort of look toward the Germans as possible partners for what they need, which in a number of cases has to do with the frameworks needed, including the bank, to start industrializing the country. So it's really, they come together around these kind of mutual modernization plans and dreams. So I'm saying that the German influence there is a definite factor. I don't think it's the only factor, but it is a definite part of the mix. And it's something that's almost always left out. Whereas I think it's actually quite significant. If that, and I think the technology is astonishing. That you're joining from Costa Rica is astonishing to me.
Thank you. The next question from Dr. Haide Sahim. Haide John, please.
I was wondering whether in your documents you came across any reaction or any mention in the 19th century documents about the minorities in Iran, religious minorities in Iran.
I have. Thank you for the question. I have. The German diplomats and German writers and publicists write extensively on, for example, the Eastern Christian communities in Iran. And on, and there are a number of British writers who write on this as well, and also Russians, but the Germans write a lot on like I know a good deal about the Armenian communities in Western Iran, mainly through these German sources. So
not on the Jewish community?
No, also, I mean, one of the things Ernst Herzfeld, the archaeologist who I was working on, which started this whole quest, he had a project, there are notes on it, he didn't write it during his lifetime, but he wanted to write on the ancient Jewish communities in Iran and was doing research on Hamadan. And so there's more in the more modern stuff, the 19th century stuff, from German writers than I know about. There is an interest in the Jewish communities, but also there's a kind of humanitarian interest in the Jewish communities in Iran because they are known to be quite poor. So there's quite a lot, and also from sort of philanthropic interests coming from France to set up schools and to set up
that comes later.
Aid initiatives toward to help Eastern Jews, as sometimes they were called, and who were they were in a situation of poverty. So you see that there's kind of this, in terms of religion and a kind of anthropological interest in the East, in the Chaldeans, in the Nestorians. There are all kinds of very interesting works written by German authors about those religious communities in what they call Persian Kurdistan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mahasi Afshar has a question. Dr. Afshar, could you ask the question directly yourself?
Sure. First
Thank
of all,
you.
this incredible presentation is just fascinating. I was wondering, in the area of intelligence gathering and activities, have you come across the name of a Baron von Wedel and his wife, Baroness Lydia? What I read in an article in Salname Dunya, where my grandfather has a short autobiography, in 1915, he was on a ship sailing from New York to Europe, heading to Berlin with Tarizadeh, when this baron was stopped. A British warship stopped their vessel, took off the baron on the charge of espionage. His wife, who was traveling with an American passport, stayed on board. But I have not been able to track either name down online anywhere, and I've looked everywhere.
Okay. Well, there is a Baron von Wedel. I would need to find the first name, but there is a Baron von Wedel who's quite important, quite close to the Kaiser before the war. So I don't know if that's the same person.
I don't know, because the article is written in Persian and there are no, clear vowels. There's a V, the Vav, Ye, Dal, and Lam. So I tried Vidal, Fidel, Vedel. I tried every iteration of that in possible German word, name, but couldn't come up. I thought Vedel because there are Vedel.
No, there is a Baron von Wedel who is, as I said, quite close to the Kaiser, and so in that sense important. And I don't know more than that. I mean, it was actually, I was reading some things about the outbreak of the war and the July crisis, and there is a von Wedel who's communicating various things to the Kaiser, is close to the Kaiser. So yes, no, thank you, everyone. I love the details, and actually this archive is really well suited to these questions because it is full of detail, and which once those details start to light up, they become quite interesting.
Well, thank you, Professor Jenkins, for your wonderful presentation. We look forward to the publication of your book, and please promise to allow us to have the book launch for you at the Institute in collaboration with... I
would love that.
Yeah.
That would be fantastic. I've been, as you guys can see from the presentation, and I've been working on this for quite some time, so I'll be very happy to have it leave my desk and have other people read it and bring their questions to it. Thank you so much for the questions. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thanks to Dr. Arzu Azad for moderating this session and collaborating with the University of Toronto.
Thank you
Everyone,
so much.
have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Please,
Thank you, everyone.